Hello, today is Thursday, May 18th, 2023. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Today, we are going to give you 5 things to think about from a contracting perspective when you procure your ICT services. To help me do that, I'm joined by my LB3 colleague, who is a partner at LB3, Laura McDonald. Hey, Laura, thanks for joining me again.
Joe, it's always a pleasure.
Hey, on the last podcast that you and I recorded, you gave 5 moves enterprises can make to save money on their ICT spend. Then our colleague Brent Knight and I discussed 5 things to focus on during a strategic procurement using an RFP. And at the end of that podcast, I promised to get back to the contracting side of things.
Oh, Joe, you know I love contracts. And I'm always happy to talk about contracting, share war stories. But for now, let's just focus on 5 contract provisions that you should have on the top of your list for your next renewal or RFP that may not necessarily be on your top 5 right now. And these are things that you should include in your RFP or a new language, or as in most cases, it's often better to just refresh the contract you have. So these may be inserts or modifications to your existing contract.
So, is there ever a time that you should just put your agreement in the trash can?
Absolutely. Not the trash can, though, the shredder. If your contract was not negotiated or was lightly negotiated, start over. If you're doing a deal with a new provider, obviously you start afresh. If you're planning on giving your existing provider a much bigger chunk of your spend or services, start over. If your contract's only a few pages long or has kind of a kludgy order of precedence, that probably means that what has happened is the carrier or provider has incorporated a bunch of online terms which are never friendly for the customer. In that case, start over. There are other times to start over as well, like if you've amended your contract a gazillion times, or the vendor has snuck in terms and conditions through the amendment process that override what you've negotiated. If the vendor has gone through a lot of mergers and acquisitions, or worse yet, bankruptcy, it's time to throw out your contract, start over.
Hey, those are great points. How about if you come back to discuss that with me in more detail later?
Oh, you bet. So back to today's topic, the 5 points. If you have a contract that you really haven't spent much time refining in the last 4 to 5 years, which would be understandable given what we're just coming out of, it's time to get it out and start looking at your clauses. And do this before you issue your RFP or before you reach out to your provider so you can identify all of your pain points. And among those pain points, here are 5 things I want you to take an extra close look at. The first is your bill payment and your reporting provisions. The second, network security and confidentiality. Third, limits of liability. I know it's an eye roll, but it's important. Fourth is treatment of commitments. And 5th are transition period rights.
That bill payments term, it's an interesting one. I've had more than one client say that they're not a bank, so they want better than the standard billing terms offered by the vendors.
Oh boy, all enterprise should want better than the standard terms. The standard terms have been traditionally 30 days from the invoice date, which is often 2 weeks before you actually get the invoice. And there's lots of bad stuff rolled into that. The good news is this is an area where we've seen a little bit of a pendulum swing. And dare I say it, the vendors have gotten a little more reasonable on it. We have seen 60 to 90-day payment terms. We have seen more reasonable provisions with regard to how you pay your bills and what happens if you need a grace period. But you have to ask for these because we've also seen some really weird billing and payment requirements. Again, the standard is often the 30 days from invoice date. And a really big thing you have to watch for are carriers and providers' attempts to limit how much time you have to dispute their bills. And their bills can be thousands of pages long.
You mentioned reporting. Is that critical? It seems like these days it's increasingly self-service through the vendors' portals, which I'll say have improved over the years.
Well, probably you and your colleagues at TC2 could write a book about the importance of getting good reports. And you're absolutely right. The vendors are pushing the self-serve module, and that's not a bad thing. But the days that your team of account reps pulling the information from you, those are gone. So you need to make sure that you know what you need, how you get it, how you manipulate the information to get it, being able to understand it. So those are critical things you should be looking at. You also need to include in your contract the exact type of report so that they don't change. Again, how you get it, how the information is saved. Make sure you have rights to share them with the TEM if you're using a TEM or outside assistance on paying and evaluating your bills. And make sure that all of this is written into your contract so you don't find yourself not getting something or paying for something you really should get for free.
Okay, what about tip number 2, security and confidentiality?
Yeah, this is a big one. It's critical in today's world. You have to go back and revisit your network security and confidentiality clauses. Too often, they were lightly reviewed on the theory that the vendors really didn't have a lot of access to your information. But today, vendors have more and more access or potential access to your information and your client's information. And you don't want that to fall into the wrong hands. Frankly, vendors are reluctant to share detailed disaster recovery plans or security structures, which I get because they're secure in part because they're unknown. But at a minimum, you should outline and put in your contract what vendors have access to, what is your confidential information, the requirement that the vendors reach at least the highest industry standard for security, that they provide audit and certifications to back up that requirement. And you need to make sure that your contract is in compliance with a growing number of state and federal laws in this area. Just in the last couple of years, California, Colorado, Utah, Connecticut, Virginia, a couple others have passed laws, and many are in play, that affect the use of data and your client's data. And of course, many folks have regulatory obligations on them because of the industry they're in. And the other thing is, if your data is being transported outside of the US or from, like, let's say, outside of the EU, you have obligations that you need to meet. And there's a good chance, particularly if you have an older contract, that it doesn't meet the requirements. It doesn't give you the protection that you need. So this is something you really want to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's clearly an important point. So I see that you mentioned another lawyer favorite here, Laura, limitations of liability. What exactly is a limit of liability?
Good question. In the law, most contracts have limits on what a party can recover if there are damages resulting from the other party's actions or inappropriate inactions. And the whole idea behind this is to take out some of the uncertainty and risk, to say, if something goes wrong, the most you're going to be liable is X.
I get it. Kind of puts bumper rails, so to say.
Exactly. And the providers want those rails to be narrow. For example, there's some standard vendor clauses that limit the vendor's liability to 3 months of charges for the services. Of course, 3 months of charges doesn't begin to cover what could be actual damages. So this is a pretty critical negotiation. If you're renewing or revisiting a contract, know what's in place right now, and then think about what are your actual risks. And then think about things like breaches of confidentiality or security. You may want to specify that those are unlimited damages, which frankly is really hard to get. But if you can't get it, is there a super cap that your company is comfortable with in place of unlimited? And also you want to make sure that things like cost of notifying your customers or credit monitoring are going to be covered as well, which might need to be addressed independently. You also really want to watch for unbalanced provisions because the vendors, and I don't blame them, they write these so that they're protected, but their customers are not necessarily so. So again, this is an area that eyes glaze over, but it's really important.
Okay, on to number 4, commitments. And I know that this is plural, commitments, meaning there are more than one type of commitment.
Right. And this is another area that we've seen a lot of change. It used to be that vendors really wanted the trifecta, a big overall spend commitment, preferably for them by the month, but at least by the year, plus an exclusivity. You agree, say, that 80% of what you buy is going to be from them, plus individual buy the drink service period commitments. And those were often more than a year. The providers still want this, but savvy enterprise customers have pushed back on these limits. And we recommend continuing to do so because there's still a few aggressive vendors out there who are pushing for this trifecta. Particularly, we've seen a little bit of a rise of exclusivity, which really should never be agreed to in a contract. They want the contracts as sticky as possible so that you stay with them. And you want as much flexibility as possible so you can do your business and get good rates for it. So again, it's a very complicated dance. Look at your current commitments to know what they look like, because that's going to affect what you want and what you're willing to do going forward. It's going to affect your timing and your leverage. And you want to make sure your new contract preserves as much flexibility as possible.
I've said this on previous podcasts. If you think that you have a no commitment deal, you need to look closely because there is almost certainly some type of commitment in your deal. And if you don't see it, maybe you should hire Laura because, as she said, she loves contracts and knows where to look.
Always happy to help. Okay, on to the fifth and the last tip, at least for today, migration or transition periods. To have that flexibility we just talked about and the ability you need to move to replacement services, whether it's from the same provider or a different one, you have to determine in advance what happens when you get to the end of your term and what happens when you get to the end of a particular commitment period. And what you want at the minimum is at least 6 months of rate stability and term stability. Preferably a year or longer would be even better. And how this looks in your contract is really going to be driven by the contract structure and what those commitments are in place. So you need to look very carefully at that. That's going to affect a lot of other provisions in the contract. Bring this issue up early. Make sure things line up so that you're not handcuffed and you can actually get reasonable and flexible terms.
All right, good stuff. Thank you, Laura. Now, what we covered here are just a few of the many provisions and requirements that you need to consider when contracting for ICT. If you would like to learn more, you can contact Laura or me or any of our colleagues at LB3 and TC2 just by giving us a call or dropping us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.